My doctor said, "You need this surgery this week or you'll die." When I told my boyfriend, he booked a vacation instead. The doctor stared at me from across his desk like he was waiting for me to understand the severity of what he'd just said. "I need you to schedule this surgery immediately. We're talking days here, not weeks." I felt my throat tighten. "I can't afford it right now," I managed to stammer. He tapped on his clipboard, frustrated. "Why have you been ignoring the pain?" he asked. "And you haven't come in for checkups in over a year." I stared down at my hands that shook from the tremors. "My boyfriend manages our finances. He told me we can't afford doctor visits right now. We've been struggling." The doctor leaned forward. "I don't care what you have to do. Borrow from family, get a loan, sell something. But you need to find a way. Please. I need an answer by the end of this week or we can't help you." I nodded, feeling even more overwhelmed at the thought that at 23 years old, I could lose my life. When I got home, my boyfriend Junior was playing games on his phone. I sat down and told him everything. The surgery, the urgency, the timeline, the cost. He barely looked up. I'm sorry, but that's just impossible." I paused. "What do you mean impossible?" He yawned. "The surgery costs the same amount as the trip I need to book with the guys. You know we do this every year. It's already planned, and I got all my outfits picked out. Maybe you could skip it this year? Just this once?" He finally looked at me. "Are you serious right now? I can't just bail on everyone. Look, doctors exaggerate all the time just to get money out of people. Just get the surgery next month." I fought back tears. "You do realize that I'm actually dying, right? That I have a deadline and the sooner I get the surgery, the better," I said, shaking. He groaned. "Oh God, spare me the waterworks. You're making me feel like the bad guy here." He reached into his wallet and handed me $20. "Here, I'll cover today's checkup. Don't bother me about this until after my trip, okay?" I didn't say anything else. I spent the next 2 days trying to figure it out. I went to the bank to apply for a loan. The woman behind the desk pulled up my credit report and her face scrunched up. "I'm sorry, but your credit score is very low. We can't approve you for any amount." "That can't be right. I don't even touch my credit card. I have automatic payments set up." She turned the screen toward me. "According to this, your automatic payment was removed 5 months ago, and there are quite a few large transactions here." I scrolled through the list. Charges I didn't recognize. Stores I'd never been to. Restaurants I'd never heard of. I felt my hands shake, and this time, it wasn't just tremors. "Can you print this for me?" I asked. I went to one of the stores from the list. "Oh yeah, I remember him," she said. "Tall guy? Receding hairline? Comes in here all the time buying stuff for himself." She showed me the signature on the receipts, all in Junior's handwriting. Everything clicked into place. The way he always said we couldn't afford things. The way he controlled every dollar. The way he made me feel guilty for wanting to spend money on necessities. We were never poor. He'd been stealing from me the entire time. I drove home to the living room where Junior was packing for his trip. I threw the receipts on the table in front of him. "Know what this is?" His eyes grew wide when he saw it. "No," he said quietly, hoping I'd buy it. I didn't. "These are all the evidence of you using my credit card to fund your entire lifestyle that you've kept hidden from me all this time." He sighed like I was being dramatic. "Okay, fine. Yeah, I used some of your money. It's not that big of a deal," he argued. "Not that big of a deal?" I could barely breathe. "I'm dying, Junior. I need that money for surgery. Can you get off my back over this? I'll give it back eventually," he shouted. "Eventually?" Tears started streaming down my face. "I need it now. Please. Just give me enough to pay for the hospital." He zipped up his suitcase and stood up. "I already told you it's impossible. The money's spent. Look, I'll figure something out when I get back from the trip." He grabbed his suitcase and headed for the door. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "I need to report credit card fraud." Junior froze at the door. "What are you doing?" "I'm pressing charges." He rushed to the airport, but the police were already there waiting. They arrested him right there at the security checkpoint. The investigation moved fast. Turns out I wasn't the only victim. Junior had been stealing from dozens of people. Co-workers, friends. He'd even taken his own parents' credit cards and racked up thousands in debt under their names. But what shocked everyone was the secret bank account they found. He'd been funneling all the stolen money into it. The authorities froze the account and started returning funds to victims. I got enough back to finally afford the surgery, which was great, but something still seriously bothered me. During the investigation, they found something else. Something darker about where the rest of his money was actually going. Something the detectives wouldn't tell me about. Until yesterday. The phone rang at 7 in the morning and jolted me awake from the first real sleep I'd gotten in days. I grabbed it without checking the caller ID and heard Detective Haynes on the other end asking if I could come down to the station today. His voice sounded different from it had during our previous conversations, more careful and slow, like he was choosing each word on purpose. He told me he needed to explain what they'd found in Junior's secret accounts, and that it was important I hear this in person rather than over the phone. I felt my stomach tighten because the way he said it made me think whatever he'd discovered was really bad, worse than anything I'd imagined so far. I agreed to come in at 10 and spent the next 2 hours trying not to think about what he might tell me, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking while I got dressed and made coffee I couldn't drink. I arrived at the police station 15 minutes early and sat in the lobby watching other people come and go until Melinda Grimes came out to get me. She was the victim advocate they'd assigned to my case after Junior's arrest, and she'd been checking in on me every few days to see how I was handling everything. Melinda walked me back through the hallways to a small interview room with a metal table and 4 chairs, and she sat down next to me while we waited for Detective Haynes to join us. When he came in, he was carrying a thick folder stuffed with papers, and he spread them out across the table in front of me without saying anything at first. I looked down at the printed bank statements and transaction records and felt my hands start to shake again, because I knew whatever was in those documents was going to change everything I thought I understood about Junior and what he'd been doing. Detective Haynes pulled his chair closer and pointed to a highlighted section on one of the statements. Then he started explaining that Junior wasn't just stealing money for trips and clothes like I'd assumed. The secret account showed payments to offshore gambling websites totaling over $60,000 in the past 2 years, and every single dollar had come from stolen credit cards belonging to me and other victims. He showed me page after page of transactions with names like BetMax International and Golden Casino Online and Lucky Strike Gaming, all of them adding up to amounts that made me feel sick. Junior had been feeding a gambling addiction I didn't even know existed, and he'd been funding it entirely by destroying other people's financial lives, including mine. Detective Haynes flipped to another section of documents and told me there was more, his voice getting even more serious than before. He showed me evidence that Junior had been running a side business selling stolen credit card information to other criminals online, and the police had found hundreds of photos on his laptop of credit cards that didn't belong to him. The detective explained that Junior had been photographing cards from friends when they left their wallets out, from co-workers who kept cards in their desk drawers, even from customers at his job who handed him their cards for legitimate purchases. He'd been taking pictures of the front and back of every card he could access, then selling the numbers on dark web marketplaces for anywhere from $20 to $50 per card, depending on the credit limit. The police had tracked some of these sales and found that Junior had made over $15,000 in the past year, just from selling other people's credit card information to strangers who would use it for fraud. I stared at the evidence in front of me and couldn't process how someone I'd lived with and trusted could be capable of something so calculated and cruel. Then Detective Haynes told me the worst part, and I felt my stomach drop in a way that made me think I might actually be sick right there at the table. Junior had been involved in identity theft rings that specifically targeted elderly people, using their personal information to open fraudulent accounts and drain their retirement savings. The detective showed me case files for 3 victims who'd lost their life savings completely because Junior had gotten access to their social security numbers, dates of birth, and other personal details through various scams. One elderly woman named Margaret had lost $70,000 from her retirement account and had suffered a heart attack from the stress of discovering the theft, and she was still in the hospital recovering when the police connected her case to Junior's crimes. I couldn't sit there anymore listening to this information about someone I'd shared a bed with for 2 years, someone I'd thought I loved and who I'd believed loved me back. I pushed my chair back and ran to the bathroom down the hall where I threw up everything in my stomach while gripping the sides of the toilet. Melinda must have followed me because I heard her voice outside the stall asking if I was okay and telling me to take my time. When I finally came out, she handed me a bottle of water and a small pack of tissues from her bag, and she didn't say anything about what we'd just learned. She just waited while I rinsed my mouth and tried to pull myself together enough to go back to that room. We walked back to the interview room where Detective Haynes was organizing the documents into different piles, and he looked up at me with something like sympathy in his eyes, before continuing with the information he needed to share. He told me they'd found evidence that Junior had been planning to take out credit cards in my name next, since he'd already maxed out my existing card and needed new sources of money to feed his gambling addiction. The detective showed me copies of credit card applications that Junior had started filling out using my social security number, my date of birth, and other personal information he'd had easy access to because we lived together. He'd even made a copy of my birth certificate without me knowing, and had it ready to submit with the applications. And if the police hadn't arrested him when they did, I would have woken up one day to find thousands of dollars in debt under my name that I never authorized. Detective Haynes explained that this was actually common with financial abusers, because once they exhausted one victim's resources, they moved on to the next available target, and I had been the most convenient target because I trusted him completely. After showing me all of this evidence, the police needed me to review transaction records to help them identify which charges on my credit card were actually mine versus which ones were Junior's fraud. I sat at that table for the next 3 hours going through statement after statement, pointing out the few purchases I recognized while Detective Haynes marked everything else as fraudulent. By the time we finished, I was shocked to realize that I'd only made about 15% of the charges on my own card over the past year, which meant Junior had been responsible for 85% of the spending, while telling me we were too poor to afford basic necessities or medical care. Every restaurant meal I'd thought we couldn't afford, every piece of clothing I'd felt guilty for wanting, every doctor's appointment I'd skipped. Because Junior said we didn't have the money had been a lie to keep me dependent and unquestioning while he stole everything I had. When I finally left the police station, it was after 2 in the afternoon, and I felt completely empty, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left just a shell walking around. I drove home in a daze and sat in my car outside my apartment for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. My phone rang while I was sitting there and I saw Dr. Donaldson's name on the screen, and for a second I considered not answering because I couldn't handle one more thing today. But I picked up, and he asked if I was still planning to come in for my surgery tomorrow morning, and I heard myself say yes, even though I felt exhausted and scared and completely overwhelmed by everything happening with the criminal case. I told him I'd be there because I couldn't let Junior's crimes kill me too, not after everything I'd already survived and fought through to get this far. Dr. Donaldson said he'd see me at 6 in the morning and reminded me not to eat or drink anything after midnight, and I hung up feeling like I was moving through water, everything slow and heavy and hard. I went inside my apartment and tried to sleep, but couldn't stop thinking about everything Detective Haynes had shown me, all those elderly victims and stolen cards and gambling websites. Around 2 in the morning, I heard someone knocking on my door, and my first thought was panic that something else had gone wrong. But when I looked through the peephole, I saw my mom Lucille standing there with bags of groceries in both hands. I opened the door, and she came in without waiting for an invitation, setting the bags down in my kitchen and immediately starting to unpack them while telling me she'd driven 6 hours overnight to be here for my surgery. She'd brought groceries, cleaning supplies, and a fierce determination to take care of me whether I wanted help or not, and I was too tired and grateful to argue with her about any of it. She walked through my apartment slowly, taking in the empty spaces where furniture used to be, the bare walls where Junior had taken down his posters and decorations, the gaps in the kitchen where he'd packed up half the dishes and cookware. I watched her face for judgment or pity, but she just set the grocery bags on the counter and started unpacking them without saying a word about how empty everything looked. She pulled out an air mattress from one of the bags and started setting it up in the living room, pumping it full of air while I sat on the couch feeling useless and scared about tomorrow. When the mattress was ready, she made me chamomile tea and sat with me while I tried to drink it, my hands shaking so badly I had to hold the cup with both hands. I couldn't sleep that night, kept thinking about the surgery and what would happen if something went wrong, and Lucille stayed up with me until almost 4 in the morning, just sitting there being present without trying to make me feel better with empty words. When my alarm went off at 5, I felt like I hadn't slept at all, and the fear hit me fresh and strong. We drove to the hospital in silence, and I kept thinking not just about the operation itself, but about the bills that would come after, wondering if the money I'd gotten back from Junior's account would actually be enough, or if I'd spend years drowning in medical debt. The nurse who checked me in must have seen something in my face because she sat down next to me in the waiting area and explained that the hospital had financial assistance programs for people in my situation. She told me they'd already started my application based on information from Dr. Donaldson's office, and that someone would talk to me about it after the surgery to go over my options. It didn't make the fear go away completely, but it helped knowing there might be a way to handle the costs without destroying what little financial stability I had left. They took me back to prep for surgery, and Lucille held my hand until they wheeled me into the operating room, her face tight with worry she was trying hard not to show. The last thing I remember before the drugs kicked in was Dr. Donaldson's voice telling me everything would be okay, and then nothing. When I woke up, everything felt fuzzy and distant, like I was underwater trying to surface. I could hear beeping machines and smell that sharp hospital smell, and when I managed to open my eyes, I saw Lucille sitting next to my bed holding my hand with tears running down her face. Dr. Donaldson was there too, checking my charts and monitors, and he told me the operation had gone well, but that I'd need follow-up treatments and monitoring for at least 6 months to make sure everything healed right. The relief felt almost as overwhelming as the fear had been, and I started crying too, partly from the drugs and partly from knowing I'd actually survived this. The next day, a woman from the hospital billing office came to my room with a folder full of papers. She explained that they'd approved me for a 70% reduction in costs based on financial hardship, which meant that between the assistance and the money recovered from Junior's account, I could actually afford the surgery and the follow-up care without going into massive debt. I signed the papers with hands that still shook from the tremors, feeling grateful and angry at the same time that Junior's theft had put me in a position where I needed this kind of help in the first place. Melinda came by later that afternoon, bringing flowers and sitting in the chair Lucille had been using. She told me that Junior was being held without bail because the court considered him a flight risk, especially after they found evidence he'd been researching how to leave the country. The prosecutor was building cases for fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse charges that could mean serious prison time, possibly 10 years or more depending on how many victims came forward. Hearing that Junior might actually face real consequences made something tight in my chest loosen a little, like I could finally breathe properly for the first time since finding those receipts. While I was still in the hospital recovering, Detective Haynes called my room. He explained that they'd identified 12 other victims of Junior's credit card fraud, people whose cards he'd stolen or copied over the past 3 years. The detective asked if I'd be willing to be contacted by other victims who might want to talk to someone who understood what they were going through, who knew what it felt like to be betrayed by someone they trusted. I said yes without really thinking about it, feeling like maybe talking to other people Junior had hurt would help me process everything that had happened. The next day, I got a call from a woman named Abigail Savage. Her voice was quiet and careful, like she was testing whether it was safe to talk to me. She told me she'd worked with Junior 2 years ago and he'd stolen her credit card information and racked up $8,000 in charges before she caught him. When she confronted him, he'd cried and begged her not to press charges, promised he'd pay her back, made her feel guilty for even thinking about calling the police. She never got her money back, and she'd been dealing with credit problems ever since, unable to get loans or even rent a decent apartment because her score was destroyed. Listening to her story made me realize how many people Junior had manipulated with the exact same tactics he'd used on me. The fake tears and promises and guilt trips that made you feel like you were the bad person for wanting justice. I felt angry that I'd almost become another person he convinced to stay quiet. Another victim who let him get away with it because he knew how to make you doubt yourself. We talked for almost an hour, sharing details about how Junior operated, recognizing the same patterns in both our experiences. I spent 5 days total in the hospital recovering, and Lucille basically moved into my apartment to take care of me when they finally discharged me. She was sleeping on that air mattress every night, cooking all my meals, because I was too weak and sore to stand at the stove for long, managing my medications and making sure I took everything at the right times like it was her full-time job. I tried to tell her she didn't need to do all this, that I could handle things myself, but she just gave me this look that said she wasn't going anywhere, and I should stop arguing about it. Detective Haynes called again a few days after I got home with an update that made my blood boil. Junior's parents had hired an expensive defense lawyer, the kind who normally defended white-collar criminals and rich people caught doing illegal things. The lawyer was already trying to get the charges reduced, arguing that Junior had a gambling problem and needed treatment instead of prison, like being addicted to something excused destroying people's lives for money. It made me so mad I had to put the phone down for a minute and breathe, because Junior had known exactly what he was doing every single time he stole from someone, every time he manipulated someone into not pressing charges, every time he targeted another victim. Melinda called me 2 days later and asked if I wanted help writing my victim impact statement for the prosecutor's office. I met her at a small conference room in the courthouse building where she had notebooks and tissues already laid out on the table. She explained that the statement needed to describe how Junior's crimes affected my life in concrete terms, focusing on financial damage, medical consequences, and emotional harm. I started writing but only got 3 sentences down before I had to stop because my hands were shaking too much to hold the pen. Melinda suggested we work on it together, with her typing while I talked through what happened. I described the medical crisis, the discovery of the fraud, the terror of nearly dying because someone I trusted stole my surgery money. Every few minutes, I'd break down crying and have to pause while Melinda waited patiently, pushing the tissue box closer without saying anything. We worked for 2 hours that first day, and only got through half a page because I kept having to stop and compose myself. The next day I came back and we continued, but it wasn't any easier. Reading back what we'd written made everything feel raw and real again, like I was experiencing the betrayal for the first time. On the 3rd day, we finally finished a complete draft. 3 pages describing how Junior's theft nearly killed me and left me with medical debt, ruined credit, and constant fear. Melinda printed it out and had me read it one more time to make sure it captured everything I wanted the court to know. I signed it at the bottom with a shaking hand, feeling like I'd just relived the worst experience of my life in written form. 2 weeks after my surgery, I was healing physically, but my mind felt like it was falling apart. Every time someone knocked on my apartment door, I jumped and my heart started racing, convinced it was Junior somehow coming back even though I knew he was in jail. I checked my bank account 5 or 6 times every day on my phone, scrolling through every transaction to make sure no unauthorized charges appeared. At night, I'd wake up in a panic thinking about money, about medical bills, about what would happen if someone else stole from me. Lucille noticed I was checking my phone constantly and asked what I was doing. I showed her my banking app and explained I needed to make sure everything was okay. She watched me refresh the screen 3 times in 2 minutes, and her face got this worried look. That evening, she sat down next to me on the couch and pulled out her phone, showing me information about therapists who worked with crime victims. She'd already researched which ones accepted the victim assistance program coverage so I wouldn't have to pay. I told her I didn't need therapy, that I was fine and just being careful with my money now. She put her hand on mine and said, being this scared all the time wasn't being careful. It was suffering and getting help, wasn't admitting I was broken, but being strong enough to heal properly. I wanted to argue, but I also knew she was right because I could barely function without checking my account every hour. I called the therapist's office the next morning and scheduled an appointment with Delilah Nakamura for later that week. The waiting room was small and quiet, with comfortable chairs and magazines I was too nervous to read. Delilah came out to get me herself, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a calm voice that immediately made me feel less anxious. Her office had soft lighting and a couch that wasn't like the stereotypical therapy couch I'd imagined. She asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I explained everything about Junior, the theft, the medical crisis, the arrest. She listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes but mostly just paying attention to everything I said. When I finished, she explained that what Junior did wasn't just regular theft or fraud, but a specific form of abuse called financial abuse, where someone uses money and financial control to manipulate and trap their partner. She said the pattern of telling me we were poor while secretly spending thousands, making me feel guilty for wanting basic necessities and controlling every dollar I earned, was all calculated to keep me dependent and powerless. Hearing her name it as abuse made something click in my brain, because I'd been thinking of it as betrayal or theft, but not recognizing it as deliberate, intimate partner violence. In our second session, Delilah helped me understand how Junior's tactics worked. She explained that abusers who use financial control deliberately keep their victims confused about money, so they won't question what's happening. Junior's constant claims that we couldn't afford things while he was secretly spending my money on himself wasn't just lying, it was a strategy to make me feel helpless and prevent me from seeking help. She showed me a chart of financial abuse tactics, and I recognized almost every single one in Junior's behavior. The isolation from family by claiming we couldn't afford visits. The guilt trips about spending money on necessities. The way he made me feel selfish for wanting medical care. All of it was designed to keep me trapped and under his control. Delilah asked how it felt to understand this, and I told her it made me angry, but also less ashamed because I'd been blaming myself for not seeing through him sooner. She explained that recognizing you've been deliberately manipulated by someone who studied how to control you isn't the same as being stupid or naive. It just means you trusted someone who weaponized that trust against you. Abigail called me a few days later and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. She'd been talking to 2 other victims she found through the police investigation, women who'd also been targeted by Junior's schemes. She thought it might help all of us to connect and support each other since we'd been through similar experiences. I agreed, and we set up a meeting at a coffee shop downtown for the following Saturday. When I arrived, Abigail was already there with 2 other women sitting at a corner table. She introduced them, and we all ordered drinks before settling in to talk. One woman had been Junior's coworker 3 years ago, and he'd stolen her credit card information to book a vacation. The other had dated him briefly, and he'd taken money from her purse repeatedly while claiming his wallet was stolen. For 3 hours, we sat there sharing our stories, and the similarities were shocking. Every single one of us described the same pattern of manipulation. Junior would create a crisis or emergency that required money. He'd cry and beg and make promises. He'd guilt trip us into feeling sorry for him or convince us we were overreacting. He'd isolate us from people who might warn us or help us see what was happening. One woman described how he'd used the exact same excuse about the trip with friends that he'd used on me, down to the same words about having his outfits picked out. Another described how he'd claimed to be managing her finances to help her save money while actually draining her accounts. The woman who'd dated Junior before me looked exhausted as she told her story. She said he'd done everything to her that he later did to me, including the medical emergency excuse when she tried to leave. She'd eventually caught him and confronted him, but he'd cried so hard and seemed so genuinely sorry that she'd given him another chance. When he stole from her again, she finally ended things, and then she found out through mutual friends that he'd started dating someone new within a week. She'd tried to warn the new girlfriend, but Junior had already told the woman that his ex was unstable and vindictive, so her warning was dismissed as jealous drama. Now she felt guilty that she hadn't tried harder to make the woman listen, hadn't gone to the police back then, hadn't done more to stop him from hurting other people. We all told her it wasn't her fault, that Junior was the one responsible for his actions, but I could see she still carried that weight. Listening to these stories made something shift in how I saw everything that happened. I'd been telling myself I was stupid for not seeing the signs, naive for trusting Junior, weak for letting him control me. But hearing how he'd done the exact same things to multiple women, how he'd perfected his manipulation tactics over years, how he'd carefully selected victims and studied how to exploit them, I realized I wasn't stupid at all. I was deliberately targeted by someone who'd made a career out of finding vulnerable people and destroying their lives for profit. He'd practiced his crying routine, his guilt trips, his excuses. He'd learned which words worked best to make people doubt themselves. He'd figured out how to isolate victims from support systems and keep them confused and ashamed. Understanding this didn't take away the pain or fix the damage he'd caused, but it helped me stop blaming myself for trusting someone I loved. The problem wasn't that I was too trusting or too naive. The problem was that Junior was a predator who'd spent years learning how to hunt. The prosecutor, Raymond Crane, called me the following Tuesday with an update about Junior's case. His lawyer was pushing hard for a plea deal instead of going to trial. They were offering to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for avoiding a trial, which would mean Junior would get less prison time, but it would guarantee a conviction without the risk of a jury finding him not guilty. Raymond explained that trials were unpredictable, and sometimes juries felt sympathy for defendants with addiction problems, which Junior's lawyer would definitely use as his main defense strategy. A plea deal would mean certainty, a guaranteed conviction and prison time, but it would also mean Junior wouldn't face the maximum possible sentence he could get if we won at trial. Raymond said he needed to know what outcome I wanted before he made any decisions about whether to accept or reject the plea offer, because my opinion as the primary victim mattered in how they proceeded with the case. Raymond spent another 20 minutes on the phone explaining how trials work and what could go wrong. He said juries sometimes feel sorry for people with addiction problems and might give lighter sentences than what Junior deserves. He told me about a case last year where a guy stole from his own grandmother to feed a gambling habit, and the jury gave him probation instead of prison because they felt bad for him. Raymond said he believed in our case and thought we could win at trial, but there was always a chance the jury might see Junior crying about his addiction and decide he needs help instead of punishment. He needed to know what I wanted because if we rejected the plea deal and lost at trial, Junior might walk away with barely any consequences. I told him I needed time to think about it and hung up feeling sick. The idea of Junior getting away with everything made me want to scream, but the thought of sitting in a courtroom while his lawyer tried to make me look like a liar or a bad girlfriend made me want to throw up. Melinda came over that afternoon and we sat at my kitchen table going through everything Raymond had said. She brought a legal pad and wrote down the pros and cons of accepting the plea deal versus going to trial. The plea deal meant Junior would definitely go to prison for at least 6 years and have to pay money back, but it also meant he wouldn't face the maximum sentence he could get if we won at trial. Going to trial meant a chance at a longer sentence, but also the risk of losing completely, plus months of stress. And having to testify and be cross-examined by Junior's lawyer, who would try to tear apart my character and make the jury think I was somehow responsible for what happened. Melinda asked me what outcome would let me sleep at night and move forward with my life. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I told her I wanted Junior to face real consequences and go to prison for what he did. But I also didn't think I could survive a long trial where his lawyer attacked me and tried to make me look bad in front of a courtroom full of people. She nodded and said accepting a reasonable plea deal wasn't weakness or giving up. It was being practical and protecting myself while still making sure Junior faced justice. That helped me feel less guilty about not pushing for trial. I called Raymond back and told him I supported accepting the plea deal as long as the prison time was real, and Junior had to pay back the money he stole. 3 days later, Lucille had to pack up and go back home because she'd already used all her vacation time from work. She felt terrible about leaving, but her boss had called twice saying they needed her back. Before she left, she told me her sister was going to come stay with me for the next 2 weeks. I tried to tell her I was fine and didn't need anyone else taking time off work to babysit me, but she gave me this look that said she wasn't asking for my permission. Her sister arrived the same day Lucille left, bringing enough groceries to feed me for a month. I was doing better physically by then, and could mostly take care of myself without help. The shaking in my hands had gotten better, and I could make my own meals and shower without getting dizzy. But having family around helped with the loneliness and fear that crept in at night when I was alone in the apartment. My aunt was quieter than Lucille, but just as stubborn about making sure I ate properly and took my medications on time. The letter came on a Tuesday, forwarded through the prosecutor's office in a plain envelope. I saw the return address was from Junior's mother, and my hands started shaking again as I opened it. She wrote 3 pages about how sorry she was for what her son did, and how she had no idea he was capable of such things. She talked about how she and Junior's father were devastated and ashamed, and how they were getting counseling to process everything. Then in the last paragraph, she asked if I would consider writing a letter supporting leniency for Junior when he got sentenced. She said he was still her son, and she believed he could change with the right help and treatment for his gambling addiction. She said she understood if I said no, but she had to ask because she was his mother, and couldn't give up on him. I read the letter 3 times and felt angrier each time. The fact that she thought I should help reduce Junior's punishment after he almost killed me by stealing my surgery money made me want to scream. I brought the letter to therapy that Thursday, and showed it to Delilah. She read it carefully while I sat there feeling my blood pressure rising, just watching her read Junior's mother's words. When she finished, she asked me what my first reaction was when I read the request for leniency. I told her I wanted to write back and tell her exactly what I thought about her asking me to help the person who almost killed me. But I didn't know if that was the right thing to do, or if I should just ignore the letter completely. Delilah said both options were valid, but she thought writing a response might help me process my anger and set clear boundaries. We spent the rest of the session working on a response letter that explained I wouldn't be participating in any efforts to reduce Junior's consequences. I wrote that I understood she loved her son, but he made choices that destroyed multiple people's lives, including mine, and I needed him to face real punishment for what he did. I said I hoped she could respect my decision and not contact me again. Delilah helped me keep the tone firm, but not cruel, focusing on my boundaries instead of attacking Junior's mother for asking. We revised it 4 times before I felt good enough about it to mail. My follow-up appointment with Donaldson was the next week, and I was nervous walking into his office. He did a physical exam and asked me a bunch of questions about my pain levels and energy. Then he smiled and said I was healing better than he expected based on how sick I'd been before surgery. That made me feel relieved until he explained I'd need to be on medication long-term and come in for monitoring every 3 months for the next 2 years to watch for problems. He said my condition was manageable now, but required ongoing attention, and I couldn't skip appointments or stop taking my pills, even if I felt fine. I asked him if I'd ever be completely healthy again, and he said I'd need to redefine what healthy meant for me, that I could live a normal life, but it would include regular medical care and being careful about my health in ways other people my age didn't have to think about. The hospital billing office called 2 days after that appointment, asking me to come in and discuss a payment plan. I'd been avoiding thinking about the remaining balance because every time I looked at the number I felt overwhelmed. Even with the financial assistance program and the money recovered from Junior's account, I still owed about $4,000. The billing specialist was nice about it and didn't make me feel bad, but $4,000 felt impossible when I wasn't working and had no savings left. She said I could set up payments as low as $50 a month if needed, which would take years to pay off but at least wouldn't destroy my credit further. I signed the paperwork feeling defeated because $50 a month was all I could promise, and even that felt hard. Melinda called me that same afternoon like she somehow knew I was stressed about money. She said she'd been talking to a local nonprofit that helps crime victims with financial recovery, and they wanted to meet with me. I met with them the following Monday, and they explained their emergency grant program. They offered me a small grant of $800 to help with immediate expenses, which made me cry right there in their office because I hadn't expected anyone to just give me money. They also helped me create a realistic budget for getting back on my feet over the next 6 months, showing me how to track expenses and prioritize bills. The woman helping me said most crime victims struggle financially because the crimes themselves create money problems, and then the legal process makes it hard to work regular hours, so they end up in this terrible cycle. She made me feel less ashamed about needing help. Detective Haynes called on Wednesday with another update about Junior's case. His voice sounded excited in a way I hadn't heard before. He said Junior's case had expanded to include federal charges because some of his identity theft victims were in other states. This meant he was facing both state and federal prosecution, which would significantly increase his potential prison time. The federal government took identity theft really seriously, and their sentences were usually harsher than state charges. Haynes said this was good news for victims because it meant Junior couldn't get away with a light sentence, even if the state case went wrong somehow. He also mentioned they were still finding new victims as they dug deeper into Junior's activities, and the total amount stolen was now over $100,000 across all victims. The next day, Haynes called again to tell me about Cole Gillespie, Junior's former co-worker who'd contacted the police to offer testimony. Cole told investigators that Junior used to brag about his schemes and show off expensive purchases at work. Everyone thought he was just talking big and making up stories to get attention because Junior acted broke most of the time. Cole said Junior would come to work wearing new designer shoes and then complain he couldn't afford lunch. Or he'd show pictures of expensive trips, but say his parents paid for everything. Nobody realized he was actually stealing money to fund his lifestyle because he was so good at acting like a struggling regular guy. Cole felt guilty now for not taking Junior's bragging seriously and reporting him earlier, but Haynes said his testimony would be valuable for showing Junior's pattern of behavior and proving the crimes were planned and deliberate, rather than desperate acts of a desperate addict. Raymond called 2 days later with an update about the case. He explained they were moving forward with a plea agreement instead of going to trial. Junior would plead guilty to multiple counts of fraud and identity theft. In exchange, the prosecutor's office would recommend a sentence of 6 to 8 years in prison, with requirements to pay back all the money he stole. Raymond walked me through the paperwork over the phone, explaining each charge and what it meant. The restitution part was important because it meant Junior would be legally required to pay victims back, even if it took years. I listened to everything Raymond said, but I felt weird about it. 8 years sounded like a long time, but it also didn't feel like enough for what Junior did to so many people. He destroyed lives and almost killed me by stealing my surgery money. Raymond must have sensed my hesitation because he started explaining why the plea deal made sense. Trials were unpredictable, he said. Juries could be sympathetic to addiction stories. Junior's expensive lawyer might convince people he deserved treatment instead of prison. The plea deal guaranteed Junior would go to prison and guaranteed he'd have to pay money back. If we went to trial and lost, Junior might walk free or get probation. I understood the logic, but it still felt wrong somehow. I thanked Raymond for the update and told him I'd think about it. He reminded me that the decision wasn't really mine to make since this was a criminal case, not a civil one. But he wanted me to understand what was happening and why. After we hung up, I sat on my air mattress staring at my phone. Part of me wanted Junior locked up forever. Part of me just wanted this whole thing to be over, so I could move on with my life. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks from now. Raymond told me I'd be allowed to read my victim impact statement in court if I wanted to. I could stand up in front of the judge, Junior, his family, and everyone else, and explain exactly how his crimes affected me. The thought of seeing Junior again made my hands shake. I hadn't seen him since the day I called the police. I made an appointment with Delilah to talk about preparing for court. She helped me understand that seeing Junior would be hard and that speaking in front of him would bring up a lot of feelings. We started working on my statement together, figuring out what I wanted to say and how to say it without breaking down completely. Delilah reminded me that showing emotion in court wasn't weakness. The judge needed to see the real impact of what Junior did. We practiced breathing exercises for managing anxiety. She gave me strategies for staying grounded if I started to panic during the hearing. Abigail called me that same week to tell me she was also preparing a victim impact statement. She'd been talking to 2 other victims, and they were all planning to speak at the sentencing. We decided to meet up at the coffee shop to work on our statements together. It felt less scary knowing I wouldn't be the only victim speaking up. When we met, we spent hours sharing what we wanted to say. Abigail talked about how Junior's theft destroyed her credit and cost her a job opportunity. Another woman described her elderly mother's stroke after losing retirement savings. We helped each other find the right words. Our informal group started meeting regularly after that, not just for the court stuff, but as a real support group. We shared resources for financial recovery. We talked about strategies for dealing with the ongoing legal process. We reminded each other that what happened wasn't our fault. Having people who truly understood what I was going through made everything feel a little less impossible. I started looking for part-time work I could do from home around the same time. My energy levels were still pretty low from the surgery and everything else. I needed flexibility for medical appointments that kept popping up, but I desperately needed income to start rebuilding my savings and paying off the remaining medical bills. I applied to about 15 different remote customer service jobs. Most of them wanted full-time availability, which I couldn't promise. A few called me for phone interviews, but when I explained my situation, they moved on to other candidates. It was frustrating, but I kept trying. Then Detective Haynes called me one more time with information they'd uncovered during the investigation. His voice sounded careful again, like he was about to tell me something that would upset me. Junior had been planning to propose to me next month. They found a ring hidden in his apartment along with notes about proposal ideas. The investigators believed Junior wanted to get married, so he'd have legal access to any future inheritance or assets I might receive from family. My grandmother had passed away 6 months ago and left me a small inheritance that was still being processed through probate. Junior knew about it. He'd been asking questions about when the money would come through and how much it would be. The detective explained that as my husband, Junior would have had legal claims to that money. He'd been planning the proposal timing specifically to get access to my inheritance. I felt sick hearing this. It meant our entire relationship had been calculated and strategic on his end. Every moment we'd shared, every time he said he loved me, every plan we'd made together had all been part of his scheme to steal from me. I ended the call with Detective Haynes and immediately texted Delilah asking for an emergency session. She fit me in that evening. I cried through most of the appointment, trying to process what the proposal plan meant. Delilah helped me understand that Junior's manipulation didn't mean my feelings weren't real. My love had been genuine even if his wasn't. She reminded me that being targeted by a skilled manipulator didn't make me stupid or naive. Junior had spent years perfecting his tactics. But then Detective Haynes called again 2 days later with even worse news. The police investigation had uncovered that Junior was involved in romance scams targeting widows online. He'd created fake profiles on dating sites using stolen photos and fake names. He'd been talking to at least 5 elderly women, building relationships with them over months. He convinced these women to send him money for fake emergencies. One woman sent $15,000 thinking she was helping her online boyfriend pay for his mother's cancer treatment. Another sent $8,000 for fake car repairs. The total amount stolen through these romance scams was over $30,000. Learning about the romance scams hit me harder than anything else they'd found. It showed Junior deliberately targeted vulnerable people's loneliness and grief. These were widows trying to find companionship after losing their husbands. He manipulated their emotions and stole their money without any guilt. The cruelty of it made me understand that the person I thought I loved never actually existed. Junior wasn't someone who made bad choices because of addiction. He was someone who enjoyed hurting vulnerable people for profit. He got satisfaction from fooling people and taking their money. The man I'd lived with for 2 years was a complete stranger to me. Raymond called the next week with another update. The federal charges and new evidence about the romance scams had changed everything with the plea negotiations. Junior's lawyer was still asking for the original deal of 6 to 8 years. But prosecutors were now pushing for 10 to 12 years instead because of the romance scam victims and the pattern of targeting vulnerable people. The federal government took elder abuse really seriously, Raymond explained. Combined with the state charges, Junior was looking at significant prison time no matter what deal they reached. Raymond asked me how I felt about the longer sentence. I told him I supported it completely because Junior's pattern of behavior showed he was dangerous and calculating, not just someone with an addiction problem. Raymond told me he agreed completely, and that the prosecutors had already decided they wouldn't accept anything less than 10 years minimum. He said the federal government was taking this case seriously because of the elderly victims and the pattern of targeting vulnerable people. I felt relieved knowing that someone in the legal system understood how dangerous Junior really was. 2 weeks later, Melinda called to tell me that Junior's lawyer was trying a new strategy. Junior had written letters of apology to all his victims, and they were being sent out through the prosecutor's office. She asked if I wanted her to bring mine to our next meeting, or if she should mail it. I told her to bring it because I didn't want that letter sitting in my mailbox where I'd have to think about it every day. When I met with Melinda at her office, she handed me a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Junior's handwriting. My hands started shaking just looking at it. I opened it and started reading. The letter was 2 pages long and full of excuses about his gambling addiction and how he never meant to hurt anyone. He wrote that he was getting help in jail and attending counseling sessions. He said he understood now that he had a problem and that he was sorry for the pain he caused. But nowhere in the letter did he actually take responsibility for choosing to steal from me when I was dying. Nowhere did he acknowledge that he could have stopped at any time but didn't. The letter made me so angry I had to put it down halfway through. Melinda asked if I was okay, and I told her the apology felt fake and manipulative. She suggested I might want to write a response for the court file explaining my feelings about the letter. I scheduled an emergency session with Delilah that same day. I brought the letter with me and read parts of it out loud to her. Delilah helped me understand why it made me so angry. She explained that real apologies take full responsibility without excuses or justifications. Junior's letter was still trying to control the narrative and make himself look like a victim of his addiction instead of someone who made deliberate choices to hurt people. Over the next week, Delilah helped me write a response for the court file. We worked on it together during 2 sessions, making sure my words clearly explained why Junior's apology felt manipulative and self-serving. I wrote about how he still blamed his addiction instead of his choices, how he never acknowledged the specific harm he caused me, and how the letter felt like another attempt to manipulate people's emotions. As the sentencing date got closer, I started feeling more and more nervous about seeing Junior in person again. I hadn't seen him since the day of his arrest, and the thought of being in the same room made my stomach hurt. Melinda noticed I was getting anxious during our meetings, and she offered to take me to visit the courtroom beforehand. She said it might help me feel more prepared if I could see the space and know where I'd be sitting. We went to the courthouse on a quiet afternoon when no trials were happening. Melinda walked me through the whole building, showing me where to enter, where the bathrooms were, and which courtroom we'd be in. She let me sit in the witness area where I'd read my statement and look around at the judge's bench and the tables where Junior and his lawyer would sit. Just seeing the space ahead of time made me feel a little less scared. Lucille called me that night to tell me she'd gotten time off work and was coming back for the sentencing hearing. She said she'd already booked a hotel room and would arrive 2 days before, so we could spend time together. I also heard from Abigail that she and 2 other victims were planning to be there. Knowing I'd have people supporting me in the courtroom helped calm some of my anxiety. The night before sentencing, Lucille and I sat in my apartment, and I practiced reading my victim impact statement out loud. I'd written and rewritten it so many times that I practically had it memorized, but I wanted to practice saying it out loud. I made it about halfway through before I started crying and had to stop. Lucille handed me tissues and told me it was okay to be emotional. She said the judge needed to see the real impact of Junior's crimes, and that meant showing my genuine feelings. We practiced 3 more times until I could get through the whole statement without completely breaking down. The morning of sentencing, I woke up early and took extra time getting dressed. I chose clothes that felt professional but comfortable. Nothing too fancy or too casual. I wanted to look put together and strong. Melinda met me outside the courthouse at 8 in the morning, even though the hearing wasn't until 9. She walked me through security, staying close to me as we moved through the crowded hallways. Other victims and their families were already gathering outside the courtroom. I saw Abigail and we hugged without saying anything because there wasn't much to say. At 9 o'clock, they opened the courtroom doors and we all filed in. I sat in the front row with Lucille on one side and Melinda on the other. My hands were shaking, so badly I had to sit on them. A few minutes later, a side door opened and guards brought Junior into the courtroom. He was wearing orange jail clothes and his hands were cuffed in front of him. He looked thinner than I remembered, and his face was pale like he hadn't been outside in months. When he glanced around the courtroom, his eyes passed over me without any recognition, like I was a stranger instead of someone he lived with for 2 years. That blank expression somehow hurt more than anger would have. The prosecutor stood up and started presenting the case summary. He laid out all the evidence of Junior's crimes in careful detail, explaining the credit card fraud, the identity theft, the romance scams targeting elderly women. He showed the judge documents and bank statements while describing how Junior had victimized at least 23 people that investigators knew about. Hearing it all presented in court made the scope of his betrayal even more clear. I'd known about most of it from Detective Haynes, but hearing the numbers and seeing the evidence laid out made it feel more real and more horrible. When the prosecutor finished, the judge asked if any victims wanted to read impact statements. I stood up and walked to the front of the courtroom with my statement in my shaking hands. I looked down at the paper and started reading. My voice shook at first but got stronger as I went. I explained how Junior's theft almost cost me my life when I needed emergency surgery. I described how his manipulation damaged my ability to trust other people and myself. I talked about the medical bills and financial trauma that would take years to overcome. I told the judge about the tremors in my hands that got worse from stress, about the anxiety that made me check my bank account multiple times every day, about the therapy I needed to process what he'd done. When I finished reading, I looked up at Junior one time, but he was staring at the table in front of him and wouldn't meet my eyes. Abigail stood up next and walked to the front with her paper shaking in her hands. She started reading about how Junior destroyed her credit score so badly that she lost a job opportunity when the background check came back showing all the financial problems he caused. Her voice got stronger as she explained how she's still paying off debt 3 years later, and how the damage to her credit means she can't rent a decent apartment or get approved for a car loan. When she finished, another woman stood up and talked about her elderly mother, who had a stroke from the stress after losing her entire retirement savings to Junior's schemes. The woman's voice broke when she described finding her mother collapsed on the kitchen floor the day after discovering the money was gone. She said her mother survived but now has trouble speaking and needs constant care that the family can barely afford. I watched Junior during these statements and he kept his eyes down on the table, never once looking at any of us. His face stayed blank like none of this was affecting him at all. When the victims finished speaking, Junior's lawyer stood up and presented his statement to the judge. The lawyer talked about how Junior has been attending addiction counseling sessions in jail and how he's finally getting help for his gambling problem. He said Junior is deeply sorry for his actions and that addiction is a disease that drove him to make terrible choices. The lawyer asked the judge to consider treatment programs instead of maximum prison time because Junior needs help, not just punishment. Then the judge asked if Junior wanted to make a statement himself. Junior stood up slowly and faced the judge but kept his eyes aimed somewhere over her shoulder. He said he was sorry for hurting people and that his gambling addiction made him do things he never thought he was capable of doing. He said he wants to make things right and pay everyone back someday. His voice sounded flat and rehearsed like he'd practiced these words with his lawyer. The whole time he talked, he never looked at me or Abigail or any of the other victims sitting in the courtroom. When he sat back down, I felt angry instead of moved because his apology felt empty and fake. The judge said she needed time to review all the documents before making her decision. Everyone sat in silence while she read through papers and bank statements and police reports. I counted the minutes in my head, and it took almost 20 minutes before she finally looked up. The judge started speaking in a serious voice about how she'd carefully considered everything presented in this case. She said Junior's crimes showed a clear pattern of predatory behavior where he deliberately targeted vulnerable people who trusted him. She talked about how he stole from his own parents, from co-workers, from elderly widows, and from his girlfriend who was facing a medical emergency. The judge said that while she acknowledges gambling addiction is real, it doesn't excuse the calculated cruelty of his actions. She pointed out that Junior made conscious choices every single day to continue stealing and manipulating people, and that he showed no remorse until he got caught. She said the evidence proves he knew exactly what he was doing and continued doing it anyway, because he didn't care who he hurt. The judge announced that Junior was sentenced to 11 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 8 years. She also ordered him to pay full restitution to all victims, though she acknowledged that full repayment was unlikely given the huge amounts involved and Junior's limited earning potential in prison. The judge said the sentence needed to reflect the seriousness of his crimes and protect the community from someone who had proven himself to be a danger to vulnerable people. Guards stood up and moved toward Junior to take him back to jail. He stood up with his hands cuffed and glanced around the courtroom one last time before they led him through the side door. That was the last time I saw him in person. I sat there feeling this weird mix of relief and disappointment washing over me. 11 years was more prison time than I expected when this whole thing started, but it also felt like less than he deserved for destroying so many lives. I knew the restitution order didn't guarantee I'd ever actually see that money since Junior would probably never earn enough in prison to pay back even a fraction of what he stole. Lucille squeezed my hand and whispered that it was over now. Melinda leaned over and said we could talk outside after everyone cleared out. The courtroom slowly emptied as people gathered their things and headed for the exits. Melinda walked with me to a quiet corner of the hallway outside and explained what happens next. She said I would receive regular updates about Junior's status in prison, including which facility he's assigned to and when he becomes eligible for parole hearings. She told me that when parole hearings happen, victims have the right to submit statements or attend in person to speak about why the person should or shouldn't be released. Melinda also gave me information about long-term support resources, including financial counseling services, support groups for crime victims, and therapy programs that specialize in recovering from financial abuse. She said her office would stay in contact with me for as long as I needed help navigating the recovery process. Outside the courthouse, Abigail found me on the steps, and we hugged without saying anything at first. The other victims who'd been in the courtroom came over, and we all stood together in a small circle. Someone suggested we exchange phone numbers so we could stay in touch and support each other going forward. Everyone pulled out their phones, and we created a group chat right there on the courthouse steps. Abigail said she thought we should keep meeting regularly instead of just texting, because talking face-to-face had helped her more than anything else during this process. We decided to meet once a month at a coffee shop near the courthouse. One of the other victims said we should think about turning our informal support group into something more organized that could help other people going through financial abuse situations. Everyone agreed that was a good idea since we'd all learned so much about warning signs and recovery resources that other victims might need to know. 2 weeks went by after the sentencing, and I was checking my bank account on my phone when I noticed a deposit I didn't recognize. It was for $47, and the description said it was a restitution payment from the State Corrections Department. I stared at that number for a long time because $47 was such a tiny amount compared to the thousands Junior stole from me. But seeing it there in my account felt important anyway, like proof that the system was actually making him pay something back even if it would take forever to get close to the full amount. I took a screenshot and sent it to the group chat with the other victims. Abigail responded that she'd gotten a payment too for $32. We all acknowledged how small these amounts were, but agreed that getting anything back felt better than nothing. I'd been applying for jobs online for weeks because I needed income, but couldn't handle anything too demanding while I was still going to medical appointments and dealing with anxiety. Most places wanted full-time workers who could come into an office, which wasn't possible for me yet. Then I found a posting for a part-time remote customer service position that let people work flexible hours from home. I applied and did a phone interview where I explained my situation honestly. The manager said they specifically hired people who needed flexibility, and that the job was perfect for someone in my circumstances. The pay was only $12 an hour, which wasn't great, but it was a start toward rebuilding my savings and gaining some financial independence. I got the offer email 3 days later and started training the following week. In my next therapy session with Delilah, I told her about the sentencing and the restitution payment and the new job. She said I was making real progress in rebuilding my life, even though it probably didn't feel that way to me yet. We talked about how I was still struggling to trust my own judgment after everything that happened with Junior. I kept second-guessing every decision I made and wondering if I was being naive or missing warning signs. Delilah explained that this was a normal response to betrayal trauma, but that I needed to work on separating my past experience from my present reality. She said healing isn't a straight line where you just keep getting better every day. Sometimes you have bad days where everything feels overwhelming and you doubt whether you're making any progress at all. She told me that having those bad days doesn't mean I'm failing or going backwards. It just means I'm human and processing something really difficult. We practiced some exercises for managing anxiety and recognizing when my fears about being manipulated again were based on real concerns versus trauma responses. 3 months after the surgery, I sat in Dr. Donaldson's office for my checkup and watched him review the test results with a small smile on his face. He told me the healing was going really well and that my numbers looked better than he expected at this stage. I would need to keep taking medication every day and come in for monitoring appointments every 3 months for the next 2 years, but he said I could live a normal and healthy life if I managed everything properly. I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders because for months I had been scared that something would go wrong or that the surgery hadn't worked completely. He reminded me to watch for certain symptoms and to call immediately if anything felt off, but overall he seemed genuinely happy with my progress. I left that appointment feeling lighter than I had in a long time, like maybe I really was going to be okay. By the 6-month mark after Junior's arrest, I had moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in a safer neighborhood than where Junior and I had lived. The place was tiny, and the furniture was mostly secondhand stuff I found online, but it was mine and nobody could take it away from me or control how I spent money on it. I was working 25 hours a week at the remote customer service job, and while the pay was not great, it covered my basic expenses and let me make steady payments on my medical debt. I had managed to pay off about 30% of what I owed the hospital, which felt like a real accomplishment even though I still had a long way to go. Every Thursday evening I had my therapy session with Delilah, and those appointments had become something I actually looked forward to instead of dreading. Lucille drove up to visit every few weeks, usually staying for a weekend and cooking meals that she packed into containers for me to reheat during the week. Abigail and I texted almost every day, sharing updates about our recovery and sometimes just sending funny memes or complaints about annoying customers at work. I had also reconnected with 3 friends from before I dated Junior, people I had lost touch with because he always made me feel guilty about spending time away from him. We met for coffee once a month, and it felt good to have people in my life who knew me before everything fell apart. The trauma was still there and probably always would be, showing up in moments when I checked my bank account multiple times a day or felt panic when someone asked to borrow money. But I was genuinely proud of myself for surviving and fighting back instead of staying silent like Junior wanted, and I was starting to believe that I could actually build a good life despite everything he tried to take from me.